So what I'm going to do is, who was in my seminar yesterday? You were, anyone yesterday in the seminar? Okay, so yesterday I did a good one on how to select the proper center pin. And I talked a little bit about rod balance and reel balance and why I like which rods and all that good stuff. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I can do some questions or some casting demos or rig up a setup, whatever you guys want. Ask any questions you've ever had. I'll do the best I can to answer, and we'll take it from there. So I wanted to start off first by talking about the rod selection. So this rod right here, this is a 13-foot rod. It's my go-to rod for everywhere in the country. It's a 6 to 12 pound rated rod. It's got one real high frame here, so you get a nice transition from the reel to the first guide. They're called match guides, and then it drops down to a high frame guide here, and it's a standard high frame guide, and I go all the way out to 8s on the very tip, and that really helps with casting, so you have less there's less amount of area for the line to touch as it's going through the guide, so you can cast further. It also helps with ice buildup too. It's really important to have bigger guides towards the tip top. The other thing I want to talk to you guys too about is when you're selecting a rod, you want to make sure that you get a rod that has a tip on it that's usually as tall as the last guide. So a lot of times when you go and buy a standard rod, what you'll get is you'll get some bigger guides at the top, and then what they do is they put a really short tip top on the tip here. And what you get is you get a really harsh angle that cuts in and then goes out, and all of the friction gets put on that last guide. So the proper way to get a rod, if you're going to select one, is to try to find one with a guide as a tip top instead of a tip top. So I'll pass a rod around. I don't know if you guys know the difference, but I'll let you guys take a look at one. And I'll show you guys on the video here. This is a that's a standard tip top. So, or I'm sorry, that's a standard guide. So that's a regular guide that we go from here to here is the same exact thing. It's the same thing here. I'm going to pass this rod around for you guys to look at. So this is a rod that's got the guide for the top. That's how it should be. So you have 8s all the way out to the tip, and like I said, you get a lot less friction and a lot less ice. And this is a standard tip top, which is right here, and it's usually a tube that goes over the end of the rod, and you get this angle that goes from here to here. And typically when you do that, you have to run these really low frame guides here, which is going to cause your line to rub against the blank in wet conditions or a lot of humidity in the air. So I really like the higher frame guides. Also, when you're picking a rod, you want to make sure that there's no like severe crazy angles anywhere in the guides. So if you notice here, I was doing a demo yesterday, and I was showing off this rod and the carbon fiber handle, and I was talking about how nice the carbon fiber is for the colder conditions. I was showing these high frame guides and how nice the line travels from the first guide, from the center pin to the first guide. I was showing how high this is. You want to get a really tall match frame or a K-frame guide for your first one, and then, you know, gradually drop down. And what I noticed yesterday in this rod was you had a really harsh drop from here to here. So he immediately, instead of dropping to a high frame guide in between, he missed the high frame and he went straight to a lower frame guide. So he went from, this looks like a size 8 K-frame, and he goes straight to a low frame. So there should have been a stepper guide right here. So that was one thing I noticed. I don't know why he did it, but if this rod was loaded, you'd see a really hard angle going right there, and it makes it really difficult. It makes it really tough on a rod because it gets a lot of wear right at this guide here. I'll pass this one around. You guys can look at this one. This is a new carbon fiber handle. It's made of real carbon. And this is pretty interesting too because it's got a carbon fiber reel seat. So the big thing with carbon fiber is it's grippy and it still has a little bit of slide in your hand. So it's more like cork, and it's not like an X-Block grip that's really tacky or a wind grip. When you're centerpin fishing and you're making these big long casts, you want there to be a little bit of movement, and something that's too tacky is really no good. So I'll let you guys take a look at this. Take a look at the tip top, take a look at these lower frame guides, and take a look at the carbon fiber. I'll show you a rod I just recently built. This is a 12-foot, 3 to 6 pound. This is a CTS. When you're buying rods, you really want to look for the proper rating. And when you see a rod rating, if it's a 3 to 6 or a 4 to 8 or something like that, a lot of times companies will build in a couple extra pounds in it. So a lot of times people say, hey Danny, you're fishing a 3 to 6 pound rod, but you're fishing 15-pound mono on it. And it's not really I'm not really so much worried about my main line. I'm really worried about the leader that it needs to protect, or if it's the leader that's too heavy for the rod itself. So this rod's 12-foot, 3 to 6 pounds. So typically what I'm going to end up putting on this rod is I'm going to put 15-pound main line on it. This is going to be used for Erie tribs. And you'll notice here I have that nice high frame guide, so I have a nice transition coming off here. Drop down, it steps down really nice. So this is really how, when you're buying a rod, how you want them to look. I also have a blood run rod that I'm passing around. You can look at the guides on the blood run rod, and that's proper. That's how they should be as well. So the other thing I really like when I'm looking for rods is I really like 4-piece rods. Unfortunately, we're kind of new in the 4-piece market. There isn't a ton of 4-piece rods available, but the reason 4-piece are so awesome is because they break down as a 2-piece. And with the science that we have nowadays, you really don't get any flat spots or weak spots when there are furls. And the 4-piece is just more convenient for breaking down for travel, or if you need a backup rod in the back of your car. And this is a 4-piece here. It breaks down to a 2-piece. I leave it as 2 most of the time, unless I'm taking a trip out to Oregon or Washington and I got to go on a plane or something like that. Then I'll break it down to 4-piece. But overall, it's a really convenient, really nice rod. So as I was saying too, with the powers of the rod, there's all different ratings. So you have a 3 to 6, a 4 to 8. You have a 2-power, a 3-power, a 4-power, a 5-power, everything in between. And every manufacturer seems like they're going to be a lot different from manufacturer to manufacturer. So I can't tell you how important it is to go and feel the rods. Every rod has its own soul. They all feel a little different. Sometimes the 2-power is always going to be lighter than the 3-power, but there are exceptions. So when you see a rod that's rated 1562 or 1563, what that means is the rod's 156 inches and a 2-power, or 156 inches and a 3-power. So getting back to it, the thing when I'm buying a rod and reel, the most important thing out of everything is rod balance. So when I'm selecting a reel, a lot of times I like something that's going to be a 5.5-inch diameter or 5.35. But I want to, first and foremost, I want to make sure that I have the right balance in a rod. So when I built this 12-foot rod, this is actually a 12-foot 2-piece. They didn't make this blank in a 4-piece, so I had to settle for the 2-piece. But I had selected a 5-inch reel to balance it out. It's actually 4.85 inches, really close to 5 inches. But what I'm looking for is I'm looking to have this balance in the rod that when you're holding the rod, where you would when you put the whole setup together and you hold the rod, what you want to do is you want to make sure that rod is kind of angling back. So all day you're not using your wrist to hold the rod up and you're beating up your wrist and forearm. So you really want to try to find a reel that brings your rod up slightly. I always say when you're checking this out, always take the rod, and you can see here this dirt spot or this egg goo here. This is where I always grab the rod. So I want to hold the rod where I'm typically going to hold it, and I want to make sure I get, a nice balance right there. So that's kind of what you're looking for. You want something that is level or slightly back like this. If your rod's dropping towards the tip a lot like this, you either need to move the reel down more, or you need to get a heavier reel. And a lot of the manufacturers, they port their reels out and they make them so light you really don't get that rod balance. So I can't tell you how important that is. So the other important thing about a 4-piece, which I didn't mention, is by having a 4-piece, your strongest section is your bottom section where all the work is. So it's all your reel seat, your handle, any sort of custom work you have. The most expensive guide is down here. So the chances of you breaking this lower section is really tough. Like, it doesn't seem like you'll, I've in the 20 years of me doing this, I think I've only seen one broken section in the bottom, which is a shame because you lose all your work, but that bottom section is really protected, and these rods could get pretty expensive. So if you break another piece of the rod, it's typically pretty easy to get it repaired because there's just a few guides on each section. So let's see. So I'll show you this one really quick, the balance of this rod here. So if I put that 535 on this rod, I would typically get this a lot. I'd have it dropping back up. And that's not horrible because you're holding it up most of the day, but you are having to use your wrist pointing down. So I typically want, like I said, I typically want to hold it in the front of the grip where I'm going to hold the rod, and that's what I'm looking for right there. That's like a perfect balance. So when they're designing rods like this 3 to 6, they built a couple extra pounds into this rod. So this is actually a true 4 to 8. I talked to the designer, his name was John Kalina, and since these were made in New Zealand and he was in Ontario, he wanted to add a couple extra pounds into the rod just to protect it. So if it's rated 3 to 6, guys wouldn't push that too much. They'd run 3 to 6 pound fluoro, and the end result would be less rod breakage, so it'd be less pain in the butt to get it from New Zealand. But that's why I said you really got to feel the rods. Not every manufacturer builds that extra poundage in, but when you see a 3 to 6, that usually means that that's going to protect a 3 pound leader, and the rod's strong enough to comfortably use a 6 pound leader where you're not going to jeopardize the integrity of the rod. Any questions about that before I go on further? Okay. So yesterday, after I was done explaining that, the guys wanted to talk about casting, and they wanted to talk about the length of the rod for the rivers they're fishing. And you would normally think the smaller the river, the smaller the rod, right? Like, you know, if the river's only 20 foot wide or 30 foot wide, you'd want something that isn't real long, especially if it's brushy. But it's actually the opposite. If you're fishing somewhere brushy, like let's say right up here, I can't bring this rod up because let's say these are trees here, and let's say that the platform here, let's say that there's bushes and trees, and this is all I have for a bank right here. The 13-foot rod allows you to gain more momentum and create more of a pendulum. So once you have this momentum from your float swinging, all you have to do is get your timing right, and you pull the line down on the reel, and you're able to get a lot of distance that way, rather than bringing it back here or back here. So pretty much all the smallest rivers, even the bigger rivers, I can do all the casting I need by just keeping the float right in front of me. So if there's brush all over, you just got to get good at your timing. And I'll show you guys. This is kind of a version of the Wallis Cast. I'm going to take 2 fingers and I'm going to go down below the reel. I got this finger here to slow the reel down. I'm getting my momentum from the float. So I'm going to bring the float back towards me, just lifting my rod slightly. I just lift my rod a couple inches. The float comes towards me, and then I pull it down, and I'm casting. And I can get easily 20, 30 feet, no problem. And the more line you let out, the further this float is down, the more momentum that float has. So you guys can see, just with no energy at all, I can almost cast, more than halfway across the room. So that's, 50, 60 feet or something, no problem. There's a couple other casts that you could do as well. The ones I always like to make sure my reel is spinning. when I'm casting. The only time that I don't want my reel to spin is if I'm running a really, really long leader. Let's say a 15-foot leader on a fixed float, and I only have a 13-foot rod. Because I have to reel the float up so close to the top to make sure I'm not dragging my presentation along the ground before I cast, I'll typically cast it off the side in that one situation. But typically, you always want the reel to spin because you're not creating any line twist when you do that. And when you side cast, you get a lot of friction with the line coming off the side of the reel, so that's also slowing down, and you're also getting less distance because of that. So my main cast I like is the Wallis Cast, and that's coming across your body like this, and that's a cross body one. This is an overhand one going this way, and most of the time, if I could do it, if I have the clearance on this side, I'll typically do a cross body, and the cross body cast is the one that you're going to get the most distance with. The only problem when you're doing these Wallis casts is you're coming at the bottom of the reel here and you're pulling down, so what's happening is that float is going up closer to the tip. So if you're running a 15-foot leader and I'm holding it up like this and I go to pull it up, that float's got nowhere to go. So in that case, I have to side cast. I got to bring it off to the side and cast like that, where it's coming off the side. And I really only do that. You can see just by doing that how much line twist I have, just by letting it off just a little bit. And I don't want to have to worry about adding swivels and all kinds of extra stuff in the rig to make sure I'm accounting for that line twist. I'm going to take a quick second break, and I'm going to save this video, and I'm going to hand this off to someone else. You doing all right with that?
Yeah.
All right.
It's still rolling.